Welcome to The Right Approach, everybody. I'm Barbara Hinsky, and this is a podcast for writers to learn more about the craft of writing as we explore a new topic each week. Today, we've got a very special guest, who Jeremy will introduce, so let's get started.
All right, so today our guest is Kevin Tumlinson. He is an award-winning and best-selling author of hundreds of books crafted to thrill and inspire. He serves as the director of marketing and PR for Draft to Digital, the leading distributor of books by independent authors and publishers worldwide, which I also use for mine. Kevin is known as the voice of indie publishing for his work in podcasts, conferences, and public speaking and consulting for authors. Every day he helps and encourages hundreds of thousands of will-be and established authors around the world. And his newest release is a novella, The Templar Tunnel. Kevin, welcome to The Right Approach.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And I just realized that this is the second time I've done this, that instead of my pen name that this is under, I currently have my given name on here, which is fine. And we've talked about pen names before, so I'm going to switch that out just for some continuity here. But Kevin, Barb wanted to start out with talking about some of your novels. So Barb, why don't you jump in there?
Okay, and I definitely will, but before I jump in, I just want to recommend that everyone check out Kevin's website, because it's just such a feel-good experience for many reasons, not because you can access all of his work, but he's got a mission statement: inform and inspire, educate and entertain. And yeah, it's just feel good. Just go in there and get the feel goods. You've done a remarkable job. I have to, as we start out, I wasn't familiar with your work, and I'm telling you what, I'm hooked.
Well,
I'm going to be disappearing from family gatherings, and dinner's going to be late. Thank you, Kevin, because you've got a ton of stuff, and I'm so thrilled to be working here. You're a master. So anyway,
I appreciate that.
Thank you. So we've got a lot to unpack in this, because you've done amazing things, both as a novelist, and you've been such a slacker, over 100 books. What is wrong with you? And you're a cheerleader for indie publishing. Looking at you, I would have thought, oh, this has to be, you've got to be like a James Patterson thing, where you've got a whole host of people being James Patterson, but
no,
it's not. This is just you. So
yeah, I have the carpal tunnel to prove it.
Oh, I bet. So let's start with your novels. You're currently writing thrillers,
Yes,
specifically archaeological thrillers, in your Dan Kotler series. Did I pronounce that right?
Yes, you did.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
Where in the world did you get the idea for archaeological thrillers? Because most of us hear archaeology and don't find anything thrilling about that. So
well, then you didn't grow up watching Indiana Jones or reading Clive Cussler books. So yeah, no, what's interesting is I started my career as a science fiction writer, because that was what I primarily read. I was never the hardcore sci-fi reader. Because I liked certain authors, and I liked more character-driven fiction. And what I found was, over the years, I was reading a lot more of books by like Clive Cussler or Dan Brown or something like that. I was enjoying those stories as well. So I branched out. Well, I was doing a podcast with my good friend and occasional co-author, Nick Thacker, and we were doing a show called Self-Publishing Answers. And he dared me on one of those episodes to write in his genre, which was thriller. And I had a keen interest in, like Indiana Jones and that sort of thing. And so I decided, well, I'll give it a shot. And I took some pieces of books that I had started and never finished, and pulled out, stories here and bits there, and eventually had a thriller. And it had a very archaeological lean to it. So I leaned in on that. I just decided I wanted to write about what I started with was, I'm going to write about out of place history. And I thought, interesting hook. And so every book has some element being an out of place historical event, artifact, something like that. And now I write more than just archaeological fiction now.
Oh, can you hear me, Barb?
I can
Am I
hear you.
back?
You're back
I'm
now.
sorry.
All right.
I
Yeah.
apologize. I didn't realize it had dropped out. I looked up and saw the little thing. So I don't know where
Okay,
we dropped
so
off.
where
But
you
you guys
left-
looked really interested for a second
we,
there.
we
Yeah,
were
you were you
frozen.
dropped off
Frozen
it.
with
You were
interest.
talking, yeah, about the kind of the one event, like a real event that then you take and run with. And I'm so
Yes.
interested in how you do that. And archaeological fiction is something that you could make, you could just go off into all the research and all the details
Yes.
and create
Easily.
a complete snooze fest, honestly. You don't do any of that. So how did you learn this? How do you pick your and then how do you make it fiction?
So, and people ask me all the time how I do my research. And my answer is really convoluted because I don't sit down to research a book. Like I say, I'm going to write about this topic and then I explore that topic. It's usually I have a net out there, kind of like if you've ever gone cast fishing, you throw that cast net out there and you pick up whatever's there. I kind of do that with ideas and with research. And so as I bounce along, and my wife and I, you may not know this. I mean, we did like RV and van life for years, about 6 years total, but we just came off of like 2 years of being on the road full time in a van.
Wow.
And so we traveled and I learned local lore and met people. And, my stories are very character driven, but they're also just a conglomeration of, ideas I pick up just out in the world. And so I have an overactive imagination and I have a love for history and science. And, those things kind of end up coming together in a big mishmash.
So I've got a question for you that builds on that. When you're writing about places that perhaps you haven't been to, how do you go about, because I had to do this with my second and third novels. One was set in a town in Germany that I had never been to. Yeah. And then the third novel was hopping around all over Greece and Italy to places I had been to, but only for a couple of days here and there. So how do you build in that specificity that's necessary to let the reader be immersed into it? And how do you get comfortable enough with the setting to be able to write that into it?
Okay. First, it does help to travel extensively. And I've done a lot of world travel and US travel. One of the things I realized pretty early on was even when I was in a different country, it's not, although certain specifics and customs are different, in general, everyone is pretty much the same. There's a sort of underlying sameness to human culture, right? With exceptions. I mean, if you're in certain parts of the world, things can be utterly alien to you for a time. But in general, people think and act and react to things in pretty much the same way. And so what I would do is I knew that, if I'm writing about a European city of some sort, well, I've been to a few and they have these traits in common. So I call out those traits to sort of set the scene. And then I do some actual research but one of the handiest things that mankind has ever created was Google Earth and Google Maps, because you can go and literally walk through a city block by block and explore it and get to know it. And then if you are kind of peering around, start looking at things like, people who live there who are bloggers or YouTubers or Instagrammers or whatever, start looking at some of the stuff they're talking about. And you start picking up local color. You can start picking up on some of the verbiage that people use. So, there's a little bit of, you need to actually be, looking, but we have all these amazing tools that make it possible for us to visit a place that we have never physically been to. So, take advantage of that. YouTube is one of my best resources for everything. I'm a proud alum of the University of YouTube. I watch and study that to get insight into everything from history and science to the culture of a group to, I love tracking down specific people and then getting, watching tons of interviews. And so that's a great way to kind of get your head around what a culture or society might be like, or what a city might be like.
Yeah, and I used YouTube a lot in writing my third book, the one that was in Europe or in Greece and in Italy, of the Roman Forum. I took virtual tours and of Mount Olympus and just all these places that I didn't have access to. Google Maps helped, Google Street View helped, but then walking through with these people giving you a tour of it, well, with video, yeah, that was huge. That was a big deal.
And functionally, what is the real difference between that and being there, other than, there are certain, and I'm sorry, someone outside in my window is smoking and I have a thing, so I'm probably going to be a little choked up through the rest of the interview.
Okay.
Excuse me. But there's, when you are exploring a new place in the flesh, you pick up on certain cues like smells, sounds, things like that, that you may not be able to fake. Sound and in crowd environment you can get from certain videos, but the taste of food or the smell of something, what does that street smell like? The way I've handled that, if I wanted those details, was to literally seek out people who have been there, either through video or blog posts or something. But occasionally I'll reach out to someone on Twitter that I know lives in this region, and I'll ask questions, do like almost like an informational interview. Just say, what does it smell like when you walk down this street? And people are kind of amused by that, so they're usually willing to help you out with that.
All right, so you are known for your expertise in indie publishing. When you started writing, why did you decide to go that route?
Originally I'd been writing my whole life, and I'd had some things published, short stories and things like that. But when I decided that I was going to write a book, originally I ended up with a traditional contract, and they paid me a pretty good advance, much more than you would probably get today. But when I started kind of putting pen to paper, it's like I went out immediately. I was in my 20s, so I immediately went out and bought a motorcycle and did bought a bunch of stuff. Once I started figuring out that I was on the hook for a lot of the marketing, and it was supposed to come out of that advance, I realized that I wasn't going to be able to afford to do it. I couldn't afford what they wanted from me, and I couldn't do it right. So I ended up selling the motorcycle and scraping cash out of my savings account and doing whatever I had to do to pay back that advance. And I still lost the rights for a few years. So I thought my career was over. And then one day, I used to work in film and TV, and my brother-in-law and a good friend of mine, the three of us sat for several weeks. We were working on kind of the idea of a streaming television show, before there was TV streaming. Like there was YouTube, but there was no Hulu or Netflix or any of that, or Netflix was all DVD at that time. Yeah. So we were developing a show we were going to produce for YouTube, and it was a sci-fi series, and I was having trouble getting my head around the whole thing. And so what I decided was to write a treatment, and the treatment turned into a novel. And I thought, well, that might be good. We'll just base this on the novel. And so looking around, though, I thought, well, I don't want to traditionally publish this. I did at first, but when I started looking around, I discovered, well, it would take years for this to see the light of day. Someone else would own a lot of the IP. And so what if I just self-published it? And I started looking around, discovered things like, CreateSpace. Amazon had just started playing around with buying that, I think, at the time. And whatever Kindle Direct Publishing was called at that time was there. So I started playing around with that idea, and I self-published, and the book ended up doing well. I had done something at the time I don't know why I did it. And for years after, I kicked myself for it. But I wrote book 1 of 3 on the cover of that book. And I regretted that and resented past Kevin for like the next 6 years. But it forced me to, I was a copywriter at that time, working in marketing, doing fairly well. That first book did pretty okay, not great, but okay. It took 2 years to write the second one. And then it took 2 years to finally convince myself to write the third one. And I'm like, I can't have a career this way. And so I buckled down and I did math again, not my strong suit, but I said, what would it take for me? I had discovered at that time NaNoWriMo, and I'd read Chris Beatty's No Plot, No Problem. And so at that point, I'm like, well, what would it take for me to write the third book in 30 days? And I did some math and figured out, well, if I do like X number of words per day, I can do it. And if my target is this, I can do it. And I did it. And at that point, I had a formula, which I even wrote a book called 30 Day Author, which gives this whole formula. I'll give it to you for free, though. Figure out how many words you need to write in how much time, and do some division and find out how many words you need to write per day. There you go. I saved you like $5. But once I had done that, I started doing it again and again, and eventually got faster and faster to where I have this thing where I push myself, where I want to reset my limits. And so I'm like, could I do it in 15 days? I could. And can I do it in a week? And I could. And then there was that fateful day where I'm like, could I do a book in 1 day? And I was stuck in Manhattan, snowed in a hotel. My family were off doing their own thing, and I had a good 24 hours to myself. And so in about 18 of those hours, I wrote my book Evergreen, which was a 60,000 word novel. I managed to do it in that day, and I'll never do it again.
So like physically typing on a typewriter, not dictating it?
Not dictating it, not on a typewriter, but
well, no, you're right, a keyboard.
I was on a laptop. I use Scrivener as my long format writing tool, and so I was able to set the word count and have a little chart up there showing me what my progress was. And I paid the wait staff. I promised big tips, and I followed through, and I said, if you keep me supplied with coffee and sandwiches and watch my laptop when I go to the bathroom, I will, whatever you want at the end of this day, I'll give you. And they did. They took care of me, and I was hurting by the time it was a painful experience, but it did reset what I thought of as my limit. Like now I'm like, there's no reason there's no excuse now. I can I can get that book done. I promise I can. So
yeah. I mean, that is insane. I think we all just have to agree. That's insane.
But I don't necessarily recommend it.
Yeah. I would think you're not trying to convince everybody. But you had to have had the plot fully formed. I mean, you weren't pantsing this, and you said you're a pantser with research. Well, you didn't have time to stop and watch YouTubes while you were doing all this.
So I am a 100% a pantser. Do not plot. The 2 novels I've plotted in my life are awful. So what I did was sort of cheat, or at least I thought of it as cheating, because I wrote the book. I rarely write in first person, right? For some reason, I got it in my head years ago that that's cheating. I don't know why, but I thought, well, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to stack the odds in my favor. So I wrote the book in first person. It was based on a series of ideas and fantasies I'd had in my life about, primarily around the idea of like, what if I could learn everything I wanted to learn just by touching someone or touching something, it was that idea of osmosis, and I had bits and pieces of it in my head already, and it was easy for me to, pull all those together. I mean, I think one of the things you'll notice is if you read that book versus any of my other books, there's a very different energy to that book. People love that book. I mean, anyone who reads it enjoys it, finds it fascinating. But I was definitely tapping into some other part of myself when I did that.
What's the name of that book? I
It's
don't think you mentioned that.
the title is Evergreen.
Oh, Evergreen, you did.
Yeah.
You did mention that.
And I
Okay,
actually
sorry.
just in the past week or so wrote the sequel to that book in a week, after years of kind of hemming and hawing about it. But I just wrote the sequel. It's waiting for me to edit, and then get to my editing team. But yeah, I saw the caveat here, by the way, is I didn't write a book in one day and it was published the next day. I wrote a book in one day, a draft, and then I spent the next month and a half editing and getting it ready. And I probably could have done that faster, but I was exhausted. I was burnt after doing that, frankly. So,
well, I really think the idea that first person is cheating is really interesting, because so my first 3 novels have all been in a third person, multiple point of view, like 3 or 4 point of view characters. And my 4th one that I'm writing right now, I'm about a third of the way through it. I'm writing it from first person.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of ways that I think it's more difficult because I'm constrained to this one
to that
person.
one POV. Yeah.
Yeah. And the story can only be about the things that they know. And I'm having to figure out how to get them to acquire knowledge in a natural way.
Yeah.
Whereas in the other books, I could go to somebody else who had that knowledge or was in a different physical space or, emotional place or whatever to get that story in. So I just think that's a super interesting perspective.
Well, so one of the advantages I had with this story, because the premise of that book is this kid named Jalen, he can when he touches someone, skin to skin contact, for the next 30 minutes, he has a copy of their memories and personality in his head. And so if you need to know something, you just touch somebody and you know everything they know. And it was an interesting hook. I mean, I sort of artificially limited things. I created rules, a magic system of sorts about how that worked. But yeah, I think the reason I've always thought it was cheating, I really can't answer it, but it kind of comes down to I think I'm very good at pretending to be someone or something. And so when I do that, I can speak from that place. It's almost like being an actor. I mean, I'm very good at just assuming the role and then projecting from that role. And I've always been able to do that, even when I was a kid. I was the kid who was always talking about, things that I was always telling adults about all these things that just never could have happened, but I believed them, and I think the key is being able to believe it. So, yeah.
So how did you, go ahead.
I was going to say, I want to get back to your series that Templar Tunnel is based on as part of it. I want you to talk a little bit more about that. I want you to tell us about that. Okay. And I want to know, is the historical crimes unit real, or did you make that up?
I made that up. And I did there's probably a completely impractical law enforcement agency, honestly. But it was necessary for something I was doing, which was in one way or another, every book I have ever written is connected to every other book in some way, some thread. And so what I was doing with the historic crimes, the idea was I wanted to be able to I had this second series I'd started, the Quake runner Alex Kane. She's a fugitive super hacker kind of thing, and she is out to help people. She was framed, and so she's trying to help the disenfranchised who are falling in the cracks of law enforcement. So I wanted to somehow, though, bring her and my Dan Kotler character into the same universe and give them an opportunity to interact with each other. So I created Historic Crimes as a sort of Uber agency of sorts. It's like a task force that pulls from all the other agencies whenever there's a need. And so that whole out of place history idea they're the ones that solve those problems. If something emerges from history that is going to endanger the contemporary world, Historic Crimes is tasked with the duty to go and resolve that. And so they have Dan Kotler is a multi-hyphenate PhD genius archaeologist, and so he's a superhero in his own right. And then Alex Kane is a fugitive, but has been made a sort of CI, which my brain won't let me come up with what that means anymore. So a confidential informant. Thank you, brain. So even though she's a criminal, they still will accept her help on these things. And she's always a step ahead. So she's never in danger of being caught. But anyway, so that opened up the door for me to bring in other stories and characters and have these crossovers. So what I've done is those two main series have so far been very intertwined with Historic Crimes, but now I'm at a point where I'm branching that out as its own series. But the only time a book releases in that series is if it is a crossover between two or more characters. So that's the way I'm going to do crossovers. I love the idea of crossovers, and apparently it's a unique idea. Nobody, I mean, I'm like, well, I've been watching the Marvel movies and reading comic books all my life. Mm-hmm. So the idea of characters crossing over and working together is natural to me, but apparently that's not something people do very often in their own series.
Yeah. I mean, you've seen it in TV for years, and LA Law and Law and Order used to do it.
Yeah.
Not all the time, but enough that it was a thing. So yeah, I think that's a really cool
and people
idea.
Get a kick out of that,
Yeah.
And it's powerful because if you came in on my Dan Kotler books, or you came in on the Alex Kane books, there's a tendency for people to stick to the character they know and stick to the stories that they came in on, right? Dance with the one who brung you. So when there is a crossover, there's a chance for them to be introduced to a new character. Well, if someone reads all those and there's a crossover, well, now it's like you get really excited because now you've had what you thought of as being two different silos, but now they're together, and it's like endless possibilities. And so I want to keep that kind of I don't want that to be a regular thing. Like, I don't want to do a monthly book about that. I want it to be like a couple times a year. These groups cross over, but they'll always reference each other. Like, I actually, in the sequel to Evergreen, so I planted something in, so there was one of the crossovers is called The Man Below. And these tend to be shorter books. I tend to do these really fast. It's another novella, but it is a Historic Crimes crossover. And the events in that book, I set something up that I knew I'd pay off in the sequel for Evergreen. And so the sequel I just wrote, which I wrote in like 6 days, it very heavily leans in on that setup. So when it releases, that's what I'm hoping people get excited about, is that now I've got this third property that is tied in through the whole Historic Crimes thing.
So it sounded like the crossover started off with creative origins that also has great marketing and branding benefits. Is that the way that went?
Yeah. I ultimately created Historic Crimes as a way to one of the reasons I created it was its own agency. So I didn't particularly have to follow all the rules of FBI or CIA or whatever. I had some flexibility. So it gave me a more creative platform for storytelling. And I can't claim 100% credit for this idea, because like James Rollins has, his own version of this in his books. There's a whole the whole Delta Force idea and all that stuff is kind of like that. But I wanted something that would resonate with my readers and still felt official, that I could expand on. I've gone to the extent of I created badges and mottos and located where the offices are in a place that could potentially be that sort of location. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun too. I've got a whole cast of characters who are tied to the historic crimes unit that I can use interchangeably throughout the books.
So
Gosh.
changing tracks a little bit here.
Sure.
There is a lot going on with publishing right now.
Yes.
That's probably like an understatement of the century. But
I need a depth finder. That's such an understatement.
Yeah. But what we're getting ready to kind of close out the interview because we want to be mindful of your time. But
Okay.
what are some things that indie authors particularly should be mindful of and paying attention to, and whether that's something like the next 6 months or 6 years that we should be looking toward?
I think what we're going to see is something that I think a lot of creatives get afraid of, but shouldn't be. The role of AI, the artificial intelligence stuff that's coming around is going to become an aid to anyone in the creative field. There's a tendency for us to see it as competition in some way, but I don't think that that's it. I've been playing around with some stuff recently that I'm convinced if people will embrace the AI, what we get to is a new level of creative work. So rather than it replacing us, it actually augments us. So that's something I think that authors should be paying more attention to. I mean, the best example I can give you, by the way, is so I've always designed my own covers. I have a design background. I use a lot of stock photography and stuff. Maybe I might do a photo shoot, but I've recently been playing around with Midjourney, which is an AI image creator, where you can type in text prompts and it will generate images. And I'm currently revitalizing all of my covers using these AI generated images. And I'm taking those into Photoshop and adding some things, tweaking some things or whatever. But a lot of them come out clean enough that I could probably just, drop that right in. So that's, I know there are cover designers and graphic designers who are already kind of panicking about that. But the smart ones that I've seen realize that now they can do a higher level of work more rapidly. And if they're willing to, put their touch to it, they can really open some doors. And I think the same is going to apply to audiobooks. You've got AI narrated books are getting better and better. To the point where they're enforcing a whole, I don't think they should do this, frankly, but they're enforcing a whole, like, it has to announce up front that it's AI narrated. Well, who cares really? If you didn't tell the reader that, what are they losing? But anyway, that's a whole other thing. But those are getting better and better. I'm seeing big players doing some incredible things there. And with writing, there's AI generated copywriting and even storytelling. I think our first drafts are going to become AI generated in the near future.
So with the AI generated art, which I've been seeing over the last few weeks, and some of it is really cool.
Yeah.
Are there any copyright issues, if you're comfortable speaking to this, that you need to be mindful of in using that?
No. So the Midjourney, if you read their terms of service, you're perfectly allowed to use this stuff in a commercial way. It's your artwork when you're done. Basically, it's really no different than if I were to take Photoshop and create an amalgamated image from several stock images, right? It's not leveraging anyone else's intellectual property per se. I mean, there are people who are doing things like, I want to see Mickey Mouse riding a dinosaur from Jurassic Park. Well, that might break Disney's copyright, but you can generate all kinds of images based on your descriptions, and those belong to you. And then I do a little bit of image manipulation beyond that, which further cements it. I actually pay extra so that my server is private, so that stuff doesn't leak out, like, because their general terms of service are when something's created, it goes into their like commons. It's all under a Creative Commons license, by the way. So they've worked out the IP side of this, but yeah, no, you're wide open. I mean, it's a creative tool, So.
All right. Well, this has been Awesome. And we've covered a lot of ground, and I feel like we
Okay.
could probably go for 2 more hours. But
Probably.
I have client emails to answer and fires to put out. So
Yes.
we really appreciate your time. Before you go, will you tell people where to find you, follow you, and buy your books?
All those things can be done at kevintumlinson.com. If that is too hard to remember, try authorontheroad.com or historiccrimes.com. Just don't forget there's 2 C's in there. Historic crimes.
Oh yeah, that's tricky.
All those lead back to me, and I collect domain names like most people. I don't know why, but yeah, all that stuff leads back to me, so you can find
Well,
me there.
it's only like $12 per pop, so that's a pretty harmless
Right.
collection, right?
Yeah, and then yeah, I'm always, my name is not easy to spell. So the same thing I tell authors when they're creating their platforms is find a way to make it easier for people to find you. Get your domain name, get
Yes.
the kevintumlinson.com. I got that, but I also got other domains to make it easier. There's no harm in that. So
All right.
that's a whole other thing. We could have another hour we could go off on
Yeah.
the marketing aspect.
Well, thank you so much
You've
for your
been a
time.
delight. Yeah, and maybe you'll come back again because you've been a delight.
Oh, absolutely. I tell people all the time the most dangerous space in the world is the gap between me and this microphone. So if you want me to talk, you just point me at a camera and let me go.
All right. That sounds great. Thanks.
All right, guys.
Thank you. Take care.